Good morning, everybody. My name is Reverend Jack, and I'm an addict.
Hey, Reverend.
And today it's my pleasure to welcome the YouTube audience to the Caron Chapel service on this day. And I have a topic and a message, and we'll get into that. And I will confess I'm just a skosh nervous. So, Chapel is organized around themes weekly, and those themes that I have developed in inhabiting the chair of the principal presider for Chapel for now the last several years come up about once every 4 months, so 3 times a year. I addressed this theme, I think last time in like September, and then probably also earlier in the year. This is my 3rd go around in the year on the topic of humility. And there are people in my life who would laugh at the idea that I could speak on humility. So I'm very mindful of that. I have issues that go way back in my journey. In the Alcoholics Anonymous big book, in the Introduction of Recovery to the World in 1939 by Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob, Bill Wilson makes an observation, which I think is quite interesting, that early on they noticed that there was a pairing of kind of arrogance and inferiority complexes in a lot of their participants. So outward arrogance, inner inferiority. Later on, 20th century psychology will talk about this as narcissism and the ego wound. And it turns out it's a deep and very human thing. And I just recently was having a conversation with someone where we were talking about how every once in a while we'll like point a finger at somebody and go, God, they're so insecure. But it turns out that many of us have insecurity, and many of us in seeking to overcome our insecurity will feign competence, and there's a thing called the fraud complex, which plays itself out. You get a job, and then it's very normal at some point in any given job, in any given role, to wonder whether people really know that you're not quite as, like great as you sold yourself for in the opening interview or whatever, and whether you're really up for it or not. And there's a continuum that exists in those very human struggles with this question of insecurity and arrogance or bravado about where does health lie? What is a healthy self-concept? And in fact, all of what I learned about this in one sense began with my schooling in Alcoholics Anonymous. Although later on, as I developed in my Alcoholics Anonymous recovery, I would think back to what I had learned in my academic studies in undergraduate about Plato and philosophy. And then I would add theological studies as a recovering person. And so I started realizing that this is the question of humility and kind of right-sizedness, when we have a right perspective of how we are and who we are, is one that you can explore from a Abrahamic religious perspective, from a Greek and Roman mythology perspective, from a ancient Western philosophical tradition, Aristotle and Plato kind of perspective. You can look at it in an Eastern lens, in Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Confucian traditions. Those wisdom traditions also speak into the challenge of finding the right place in the point about a right place is that overly self-abasing stance, like, oh, I'm a worm and I'm awful, turns out to also be a kind of a drama play and not necessarily a healthy place to be. Whereas on the other hand, I'm untouchable and I'm great and I'm wonderful and I'm unassailably great is, seems to me clearly, I will say, not a wise stance either. So here's this person who has fallen more to the arrogant bravado side than to the I'm a worm side. Trying to spend a few minutes with you to kind of think about where humility lands for us today and what its call might be to us as a community as we seek to participate together in the Caron Chapel experience. And So doing my study to get ready for today, I found and sort of recommend to you, which I not always recommend, but the Wikipedia article on humility did a great job of spanning the complex landscape of different discussions and places where this theme arises. And in the Catholic tradition, humility is a virtue associated with temperance. In the Christian traditions, besides the Catholic traditions, humility is a virtue, sort of a word that we find strong in the Catholic tradition. I would argue in the Christian tradition, it's still a virtuous idea. In other words, it's an ideal. You can look in the gospel text of the followers of Jesus and talk about them being sent out without pretense and without lots of possessions, as if finding value and worth in the right scale and way is the story of Narcissus in the Roman and Greek tradition is a really helpful text to look at if you want to sort of think about this from that perspective. If you read the Greek playwrights and the question of hubris and pretending to the gods, thinking too much of ourselves, that's a place where this also comes into play. It's a deep, deep issue. And it's kind of thought to be, in many of these places, one of the Achilles heel problems of the human creature. That we leave ourselves open even when we're highly defended and conduct ourselves in an extremely skillful way. This is a particular trap that can cause us to fall. And I always like in the chapel messages to spend a little time touching base on my own experience. And I was thinking and praying about it. I have a particular story. I have a bunch of stories which illustrate my challenges with humility. But I will say, over the 3 decades of my sobriety, I had a curious sort of pattern emerge, which is that around the 10-year marks, 10, 20, and 30, I've found myself in kinds of moments of crisis. And I'm not a numerological person per se, but I just think it's interesting. And it may have set me up, because by the time I was headed to 30, I was anxiously trying to avoid the pitfalls of 10 and 20. And in my reflection about what had happened at years 10, 20, and 30, a common theme is the lure of pride, arrogance, and is a kind of trap for me. So I have significant work that I've had to do in my own recovery to repair damage done in my life from this prideful, arrogant, excessive hubris in my journey. And fortunately, in no one of those cases did I find myself drinking or using substances again in an unhealthy way. So I stayed sober, but I would argue that my conduct was less than sober. And I think that that's one of the really important distinctions, is that understanding that recovery is more than just not drinking, and that one of my patients this week was talking about balance, and I jokingly said, I know what balance is. It's that thing I keep swinging by. But balance is a desirable attribute, and a tricky one for many of us. I think one of the things that's happened in the pandemic period is that the Caron Chapel service has become very patient-focused in a way that perhaps is good. But we used to have family and alumni in almost equal measure, patients, family, and alumni, and some staff were part of a bigger sort of chapel audience. Now we have the family and alumni on the YouTube audience in delayed form, asynchronously. But let me think about with you just for a minute, as a brand new person, or as a person trying to resume recovery with previous sobriety experience, but having found their illness flaring back up again and coming into programs like our relapse program, which would be generally the primary audience of the chapel today. I had an insight this past week as I was preparing for today's message, which was, for me, a new thought about the humility issue. And I think it was triggered by listening to NPR, or perhaps the events of the, there's so much going on today in politics and global concerns, and I try to steer fairly clear that in my messaging today, but I think I was listening to something, and I heard somebody talk about, and I can't remember if the adjective was eventual or grudging, but either one works, eventual or grudging humility. And I thought it was especially illuminating, because I think the thing I got lured into by all of my study about all this stuff is this idea that I should have humility like out of the gate. Like I should come into the world and be humble, and that any arrogance and pride I've acquired is off course, and I should just return, and that humility is the sort of normal center. But I think that might not be correct. I think that, in fact, like we learn to not touch hot things by burning our hand on the stove and then pulling back, or as an alcoholic, the very first time I drank significantly, I threw up, and that should have been a clue to me that I probably was, touching a hot stove, but I kept going back and back and back. I'm a person who stands in front of you now in the 7th decade of his life, and in the 4th decade, I pray, of my recovery, feeling like I can speak about humility as a grudging and eventual, capitulation. Because I have seen how my thinking of myself as too much, and excuse the language for those who might be offended, but it's a badass or whatever, it's laughed at by people who know me and love me. I have a funny interchange with my wife and I is, I call myself rugged, and she goes, yeah, right, yeah. But I'm not rugged, when I get the toolkit out and I'm going to look at the fuse box, she's like, we better call an electrician. Learning my limitations has been something I have grudgingly done, and that particular one is a hilarious illustration. I was drunk and high one day, but I was underneath a house in the crawl space, and I was thinking I could do something, to fix a water pump with a frozen pipe or whatever, and I didn't notice that there was an open and exposed junction box that somebody previously had not, and so I put my head up into the junction box and fried my and shot halfway across the crawl space and came to a few moments later and realized I'm a danger to myself and others when I get the toolbox out, because just among the other ridiculously stupid, I lack common sense. This is what I have learned, is that I'm not good at that. I'm absent-minded. I can tell you about how I test well on various academic scores, whatever, but then I can be the idiot who puts a bullet on a toaster, and then hear a pop all of a sudden, and I'm like, what the heck was that? And realize that the bullet, the cap on the bullet went off. That happened also in my drunkenness. So this is my highly skilled accomplishment set, and grudging humility. I actually think that's a very, very powerful gift I want to offer you as a Caron patient. I do want to ask you, have you thought through whether you have suffered enough? Trying to, hold it together and manage, and so often the recurrence narrative is, I thought I could drink again. I thought I could do it again. And then it's really important to ask whether you have you, in the AA terms, it's admitted complete defeat. We have to shatter that illusion, is one of the things that Bill Wilson would say. That the notion that we could somehow safely resume intoxication after the incredible evidence, not only behind but around us. And that would be my thing. So I think one of the things that's really cool about Caron is we have early and late stage addiction people in close proximity to each other. On your unit, you might be a person who would say, well, I'm not that bad yet. But my guess is, take a look at your roommate or the person across the hall, and you'd be like, well, at least I'm not bad at them. They might be there as your teacher to be a preview of what's ahead for you if you allow yourself to be lured into the notion that you're not that bad yet. And my favorite analogy as we get to this discussion of the not that bad yet thing is, if I were to discover I had a melanoma from a total skin exam, which I just had a few weeks ago, unfortunately no discoveries of melanomas in spite of my lots of sun exposure in my life, I wouldn't want to wait until the melanoma metastasized, because I don't think the skin cancer is that bad yet. And people are like, oh, well, that's not a fair comparison. It is a fair comparison. This is a terminal illness. This is a thing that, and it not only should be measured in deaths, whether it's opioid deaths, which is our focus, and like much of the contemporary political sphere about addiction is opioid death, which is obviously a thing we should worry about. But I'm worried that we don't measure divorces, we don't measure lost jobs, we don't measure liver disease statistics, we don't measure, nasty, horrid fights between couples and the break of otherwise salvageable relationships. We don't measure families and social institutions. Like, the scope of harm that comes from substance use disorders should not be measured in deaths alone. And if that's what you're waiting for to decide that the problem is bad enough, think that through. I haven't died yet? That's not a good measure for whether you have a problem or not. So, how much is enough pain for you to be brought, this is the proverbial thing, to be brought to your knees, to be taken down, and I don't know if you like hummus, I like hummus, but hummus, human, and humility are thought to come from the same early language Sanskrit roots, which have to do with earth or groundedness. Coming up in a few weeks, the Christian traditions will have a thing called Ash Wednesday, and I have not figured out yet whether we can do some sort of COVID-appropriate observance of that tradition, but the phrase that goes with the Ash Wednesday observance is, remember you are dust, and to dust you shall return. And I would say that to those of you who are enamored of your greatness, or enjoying toying with the notion of your capacity to be the exception. A recent patient, I'm going to finish here in a couple minutes, but a recent patient who I found very challenging to work with. None of you, of course, are challenging. But I was pouring my heart out, and I found myself saying, you have all kinds of options. So yes, the 12-step traditions are there, the recovery Dharma tradition is there, the smart recovery movement is there, the life ring is there. There are all kinds of things, but the thing, let's say this person's name is Alfred. I said, the thing that I don't think is going to work is Alfred Anonymous. And Alfred said, I don't know, it sounds pretty good to me. That makes, I feel a sadness in my soul when that person says that. Because what I hear is that they don't understand how dark their testimony is. That's a testimony to not needing anyone else, to knowing better than everyone else. There's a reason why when you look in philosophy and contemporary academics, in every religious and spiritual tradition that I could name, you find this issue of right-sizedness. No, none of us is a worm. None of us is so horrid. My dear friend Father Bill, who used to preside here at the chapel service, I heard him say one day, and I thought it was one of the most extraordinary things I'd ever heard a practical theologian say. He said it to a person who was very broken. I'm pretty sure you didn't invent any new sins, was his line. I'm pretty sure that's true. I'm pretty sure you're not the most horrible, but I also am pretty sure the Buddha is not in the room. Jesus is not returned. And that Washington, D.C. is lacking a savior, right? Like we don't, I don't think there is these ideas of someone who trots in on a white Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings or whatever. And that's a great character to look at in literature, to look at Gandalf and look at his curious mix of extraordinary power and wisdom and humility. There are moments when he is offered the capacity to wield his extraordinary heritage, and he knows it would turn in a dark thing, and he struggles with it, but leaves it be. So, every one of you will have to make that decision every single day from here on out. You will have, this is the wrestling match that we have with alcohol. And AA's way of framing it is more powerful than us. That can be a humble pill to swallow. It can be hard for, what do you mean? Alcohol is more powerful. No, unless I ingest it. It's funny, that's an interesting line. I would argue for me, I'm probably alcohol, even if I don't drink it. Like in a funny way, it can like worm its way in my brain, and it can encourage me to think of other ways I can meet the craving need. So it's exerting its influence even when it's not in my body. And the wise counsel that I have received from my sponsor and my attendants at Alcoholics Anonymous all these years is a daily admission of defeat. A daily willingness to let go of that seemingly attractive pride, arrogance, I'll do it myself, teenage foolishness. So I'm glad you're each here. I'm glad those of you who are listening. I invite you to join me. Let's seek a grudgingly humble day. Let's I've burned my hand on the stove enough times. I hope you have as well. God bless. Thank you. Thank you, Marty.